Welcome to HR Voices, a podcast where people leaders share their side of the story. We talk about the challenges they're facing, how they're addressing them, and what changes they hope to see as the workplace evolves. This podcast is sponsored by All Voices, the all-in-one employee relations platform. Hello, and welcome to HR Voices. I'm your host, Rebecca Taylor, and I'm here with Robert R.C. Whitehouse, the Chief People Officer at MiQ Digital. Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. And for those who are new, HR Voices is a podcast that explores real and fabricated, anonymized employee relations scenarios through the lens of experienced HR and people leaders, just like Robert here. So we're going to be evaluating a realistic workplace situation, and we're going to demonstrate how someone in Robert's position will assess risk, apply judgment, and design practical responses. So the goal here is to reveal how strong HR leaders think when facing ambiguity. We're not necessarily looking to find one single correct answer, because in HR, we so rarely have one. So, Robert, are you ready for your scenario?
Ready for my scenario.
Okay. This one's called the complicit bystander. During a workplace investigation into harassment allegations, multiple employees admit they witnessed inappropriate behavior but didn't report it. Some say they didn't think it was their place to intervene. Others say they mentioned it to their own managers but never filed formal complaints. HR is now questioning whether the bystanders should face discipline for failing to report misconduct they witnessed, especially in a company with a clear reporting obligation policy. So, as we absorb this particular scenario, let me just start you off right with what stands out to you as the most risky or the most unclear of what I just described.
The most risky part that's also the most unclear is who knew what, when, in terms of the need to report. My experience has been that sometimes people know they're supposed to report, and other times people do not know that they're supposed to report. You know, they all say, yes, I read the handbook. Yes, I did these things. But in the moment, all of that knowledge kind of goes out of the mind, or they didn't actually read it, so they didn't know. So that
Yeah.
feels to me the most important based on what you've shared so far to get at the heart of that.
Yeah. I think that's good, is just kind of like know what they know or try to figure out what they know, so you know whether you're dealing with non-compliance or ignorance or
Right.
likely a combination of something, right?
Exactly. It's the idea of, did you willfully make a choice not to report in that
hmm
moment, or were you just not sure, or did you just not
Yeah.
know? Right. That's
Yeah.
it's a different, I think the intent and the decision in that moment is an important data point. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, is sort of intent is something to kind of try to understand without assuming first, just kind of go in face value and then try to figure out like what's going on and where do we begin with this. So in that, who would you like, other than, so you're trying to understand like what people know and what they don't know, who do you talk to first?
I'm going to make an assumption here that we have verified that the thing being discussed has happened, that we've already verified the facts that this moment took place. These people
Yeah.
didn't report it. Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, who would I speak to? I would speak to first, I would start with the managers, because you mentioned there that some of the managers, people said, I told my manager, but we never saw a report. So I would want to speak to those managers and check, did anyone ever highlight this to you? And that is partially because, in this kind of hypothetical scenario, I would want to hold our leaders probably to a different standard than I would just your average employee. If I think about, say, someone who's worked for a few years, someone comes to them and tells them something and says, I don't want you to say anything. I don't want it to be a big deal. That's a difficult position for you to be in with your colleague, right? So I can
Oh,
understand
yeah.
how you might wonder what to do in that case. For a manager, though, my understanding, and I would hope, is that your managers understand the expectations of the business and they would understand their duty of care and their responsibility in that moment. So I would start with the managers. Did anyone share this with you? Were you ever made aware of anything like this? That would be the place I would start to get a sense, because in that case, if they said, oh, yes, my direct reports told me, then the direct reports actually did the right thing. They actually did follow
Yeah.
policy. They brought it to a senior level person, someone more senior than them. And if the managers, said that I didn't do anything after that because they said they didn't want anything done, then that's non-compliance. I hate that word, but that's what it is. It's like non-compliance. A notice to you is notice to the company is the sort of mentality, right? So that's where I would start.
Yeah. I think it's a good start too. I'd agree with you just starting with the managers because they're supposed to know better. Like you said, they're supposed to have sort of a duty of care. And that's for some of the people said that they told their managers. There's also the subset of people that said they didn't think it was their place to intervene. So what do you try to understand about that group? Like,
Yeah.
what's your thought there?
It would be similar where I'd want to understand, okay, why did you think it was not your place? What was said in the conversation again? Because if someone's saying, you have to promise me you're not going to tell, there's strata and layers in every organization of people's professional maturity and experience levels. So all of that I would want to take into consideration, but I want to understand what was the scenario that made you think you didn't need to report this? Because I also need to make a sort of a understanding and make sense of did they think it was a big deal in the first place? Everyone sometimes has a different scale about what rises to the level. So understanding all of that will allow me to say, okay, is this a willful decision to not report something that they knew was problematic? Or is this that they didn't recognize it as problematic? Or is it that they didn't know what to do and their friend made them promise that they wouldn't say anything? And so they kind of just felt trapped in the moment, or they just didn't know they had to, right? And then
Yeah.
from there, it really becomes a question of, is this a disciplinary action or is this an education moment, right? Is this, and it can be both, by the way. But I think that's what I would be trying to get at. And again, I think you have to take the context of their role, their tenure, their professional journey, right? If it's someone who was an intern 6 months ago and this is their first job out of college, you might be a little bit more lenient because they're still learning. If this is a
Yeah.
20-year veteran of the workforce, that's a different scenario.
Yeah. I think that's important is just sort of level of experience navigating stuff like this as an employee. Because especially when it's, if you hear of something from a friend, or a friend that you work with and they ask you not to tell someone,
Yes.
it is complicated. Like it is hard as the employee to kind of know. And I think there's also do they know that there's a reporting obligation? And if so, do they know how to do that? How do they go about doing that, right?
Right.
And there's especially with situations, like harassment, there's power dynamics involved. People are worried about being the person whose name is on something. So then it's never, I say this all the time, it's never as straightforward as just like, there's a policy, you should report it, end of story, right?
It's never that simple, because there's the human heart, human dynamics at play here. We say it can be hard for people in those moments. It's hard for HR in those moments. You've done the job.
Oh,
When
yeah.
someone comes to you and wants to report something, and it's like, I really don't want you to do anything. I just needed to tell somebody and you felt safe. There is a moment where you're like, I don't want to make their life more difficult and I don't want to do something that they're asking me not to do. But it has to be balanced with, okay, but what's my
Yeah.
responsibility, my duty of care, not only to the individual, but to any future individual who could be impacted by whatever this behavior is, but also the larger business. But that conversation happens. I think HR people would not be honest if they didn't say that at one point or another, they've had that internal dialogue about like, do I, don't I? I know I'm supposed to, but I really don't want to make, Rebecca's life difficult. So maybe is
Yeah.
there a different way to do that? I mean, I think everybody does those mental gymnastics, but hopefully HR lands on the right outcome where it's like, I do have
Yeah.
to do something, right? But
Yeah.
I think it's hard for everyone, you know?
Yeah. I agree, especially when, folks they want to be able to go to HR and they want HR to say, everything you tell me is confidential.
Correct.
And that's just not true.
So,
And that to me is where HR loses so much trust with people because they say that everything is confidential or they say this is a safe space, you can tell me anything without the caveat of, but if it falls into some of these buckets, I can't keep it confidential. I'm not a therapist, right? I'm not a priest. Like I also have a duty to take something above this. So, I don't say that to scare you from saying something to me, but I do say it to set expectations of I may have to take action. I may not be able to keep this quiet.
yeah. We try and be really clear with that. in the trainings that we do in the business. So when we do bystander intervention training, we talk about, um, that you have a duty of care, and notice to you is notice to the company. If it's something that rises to the level of harassment or, wrongdoing, that you have to report. And we put that in the training, but we also sprinkle it in where we can in conversations around like HR is here for you. HR is here to make sure you have a good experience and that this is a good culture. Part of the way that we do that, though it may seem counterintuitive, is by taking things where they need to be taken when we hear something problematic, right? For us
Yeah.
to go handle it by ourselves is not the right course of action.
No.
So it's hard sometimes for people to understand, but I think also for HR professionals, being open about that whenever you can reinforces that. So people understand, the HR role is the complicated one. You work for the business, you work for the people. You're there for the people, you're there for the business, right? And thinking of it as a collective, I find sometimes allows it to be an easier decision because you're like, it's not
Yeah.
just about this one person in this moment. It is about anybody who could be impacted in the future. It's also about the broader business.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's about setting precedent too, without getting into all of the details of what that means. But, if you address something one way, one time, and you address different claims inconsistently, then that opens up a whole other can of risk and worms of all kinds that, you just kind of you don't want to do that.
No, you don't. I mean, it's my grandmother used to say what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You can't have different types of process depending on who you are in the business or where you fall. You have to,
Yeah.
you have to do I mean, that's why HR has sometimes a difficult job is you have to
Hmm.
sometimes do difficult things.
Yeah. I feel like most of the time it is because it's so much of judgment of, usually it's sort of one of those scenarios where everybody loses a little bit of something. And that's just because that's just people just working with people, working with organizations. That's just like the truth of it, right? The company might have to give on something, an employee might have to not have the outcome that they're looking for. And that's just the reality, of a lot of things that we see. And, if this case were in front of you, are there any assumptions that you're careful to not make?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about intent earlier.
Yeah. Yep.
I try really hard not to assume intent,
Mhm.
so it would be very easy to be, like the queen off with their heads. They've all violated the policy. There's no gray area. It's done. That's not my version of HR. I don't think it's a particularly effective version of
No.
HR. I think it
Agreed.
dehumanizes and takes the human out of the equation.
Yeah.
So I try never to assume intent. I actually try to assume the opposite, which is that, they may not have known. They may just not have known. So trying to go in free of like memory or desire, as I've heard it say in sort of group dynamics work, like there's no
Yeah.
story in my mind. I just am here to collect information. My job is to be impartial, to look at the facts. I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, but like I also can't be going around with those assumptions. So I tried to avoid assuming intent. Also try to avoid assuming any kind of outcome. I found in my career sometimes it's the human mind to say like, okay, if the answer is they did know and they willfully chose not to report it, your mind just goes to, okay, so what would happen then? I try and
Right.
stop that and shut that off when I can, because I think sometimes it influences the types of questions you ask, the kind of outcome that you're seeing in your mind because you've thought it and done the thought exercise can influence it. So I try and just stop that when I can. Like if I find myself doing that, it's like you don't know what happened and you won't know until you're done with that conversation.
I think that's such good advice because it's so easy to want to say, if this is true, then this is true, and this is true, and this is true. But we have not yet established if the first this is true,
Right,
right?
right. And it's complicated. I mean, there's always two versions and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah,
Another saying my grandmother used to say, right? And
it's true.
it's very important, and I think again, I try and go in and just say I don't know anything until I know something.
Yeah.
That's when I
I
act.
think that's it. Yeah. And we may never actually get to the actual truth in these because, like you said, there's so many different versions of it. And what's true to me might not be true to the other person who's involved. But as HR, we still have to find the thing that we still have to make the judgment at some point about what to do or what's true and what's not to the best
Right.
that we can, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we are not judge jury,
Yeah.
that's not our job. I think of our job when it comes to these moments, which are hopefully few and far between for most HR
Yeah.
professionals, right? Like that's why this is such a powerful example. It's like these happen rarely, but when they
Yeah.
do, they stick in your mind.
Yeah.
It's like, I always tell the team, we don't go in to judge. We're not deciding the outcome. We need to collect the facts. That's step one. You just got to understand what has gone on.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, at some point, HR has to make a call of some kind, right? So you've done your investigation, you've collected as many of the facts as you can. How do you weigh the competing pressures in a scenario like this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of laying it all out on the table, figuratively and literally. It's like, okay, what have I learned through the conversations that I've had? Okay,
Hmm.
those are those facts. Okay, then I have to think about the broader context. Where do they fall in the organization? What is their role? Do they have any kind of disciplinary history before that, right, or not? Um, and I think you just have to go back to, I'm a big fan of thinking about what are the values of the organization,
Yeah.
what decision is going to align with our values. That is
Yeah.
the guiding principle. So when there's all these competing priorities, it's like at the end of the day, could someone say that the outcome that we've chosen, the decision that we've made is aligned with our values? Then I can be with that decision, right? Because I
Yeah.
believe in our values. If it feels incongruent with our values, it's probably not the right decision, right? And so I
Yeah.
try and really focus on that, which silences the noise around the if this, then that, then that, then this. It's just sort of like,
Yeah.
okay, what is the most consistent with our values? If we say we are about backing each other and challenging each other, for example, does this decision back people and challenge them, or is this letting someone off the hook? If it's letting someone off the hook, it's probably not the right decision because that's inconsistent with who we are.
Yeah.
And I really try and push all of us to think that way, as values as a compass. They set direction. They don't necessarily
Yep.
tell you exactly what to do, but they set direction. Mhm.
Yeah, it's so true. I read something, I'm gonna butcher the quote, but it's something like culture is the worst behavior that your company will tolerate.
I
It's like
saw
your
that.
company culture is the worst behavior that they'll tolerate. And these are the moments where you can say, is our culture is it truly these values of what we stand for? Or if we let something slide, that then becomes our culture, whether we update our values on the wall or not, right?
Exactly, exactly. I mean, and you have to make room for people being people. I think again, like the sort of very command and control model of HR is just not, I'm not a fan
Yeah,
of it. There are
agreed.
obviously environments where it must be that way, right? Where you
Yeah.
have sensitive information, things like that, right?
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I think the most effective form of HR is always just keeping the human in it, right? So, like,
Hmm.
people make mistakes, right? And that is context that must be considered as well. If you have a star performer who has made a mistake, do you give them some education, try and change the behavior? I mean, there's obviously a scale of what that mistake is. Is that a huge mistake, a small mistake? But
Hmm.
those are all the decisions that have to be weighed. But I think it's important just to call out, I think like understanding that humans are human. They're going to make mistakes. They are not perfect, flawless. They're not
Yeah.
robots, right? Everyone has said something maybe that they went, "Ooh, gee, I don't know if I should have said that."
Yeah.
Char has done it.
Yes.
I mean,
We
it
all have.
would be dishonest to say that we have not, right? Where we're like,
Yeah.
skated the
I don't
line.
know.
Yeah.
I've been perfect the whole time, so I don't know what you're talking about. Everyone's lucky to be around me.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Yes.
I want to go back to something you said earlier that is like, that you're kind of getting around now too, is you said, could this be a moment? Because one of the questions in the scenario is, do we punish the people who didn't report? So you mentioned something that this could be an opportunity for punishment or education, or maybe not punishment, consequences, right? Consequences or education or both. What could that look like in a scenario like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, it depends on the intent piece of the equation. But I think
Yeah.
if I think about what would probably be the case is I would probably err on the side of education because my instinct and my experience tells me that most of the time it's that they're not sure what to do. So I think punishing people sends the wrong message because then it becomes a conversation about compliance. And the
Hmm.
whole point of reporting is lost in that conversation, right? Like nobody's
Yeah.
going to walk out of that room and think to themselves, gee, yeah, it's too bad what happened to that person, and I need to report to make sure that they're okay and because it's the right thing for business and, for the culture. They're going to think, "Oh my God, I'm never going to say anything to anybody ever again because I'm just going to get in trouble for it. I thought I was
Yeah.
doing the right thing." So I think education is where I would probably go. For managers, maybe, again, I might hold a different standard where it's like you
Yeah.
get the education, but also here's a written warning. Like this
Yeah.
cannot happen again. Again, if I found out someone like was deceiving or trying purposely not to tell, even when asked to tell, very different scenario. That is more disciplinary, firmer hand. But I think the education, because the point that you want people to walk away from this is not you have to report everything. What you want
Right.
them to walk away with is that the duty of care exists, that the reason that we carry things forward is because, your name is on the screen. Rebecca might come and say, I don't want anything done. But Rebecca has
Yeah.
taken the time to tell you this thing has happened, which means
Yeah.
somewhere she needs an outlet. Something needs to be done.
Yeah.
I say often that a complaint is sometimes a request in disguise. I think
Yes.
sometimes a sharing of something is a request in disguise as well.
Yes.
I'm going to tell
Oh,
you I don't
yes.
want you to do anything, but I have still made a conscious effort to tell you something that has impacted me. I think there's a request in there. And so I
Yeah.
try and remind people of that. But again, I think it's education. Education, because then next time they spread the word about the duty of care, the duty to
Hmm.
report. And it
Yeah.
becomes less punitive and more about education and creating the culture that you want, which is people speak openly to each other.
But it's true. I mean, you want to kind of treat it as, I like what you said. A complaint is sometimes a request or an ask for help in disguise. It is true. And it is natural to sort of say, this is the thing that happened. And then you're naturally kind of backpedaling with, I don't want to make a big deal of it because now all of a sudden it's nerve wracking as the person who that's happened to, right? But
Yes.
if you've made enough people aware, because it sounds like there's enough people in this scenario aware that you've spoken to more than one person about it, right?
Right.
You are looking for some kind of a support. And it is kind of a chance as HR to take a collaborative approach to sort of say, hey, look, if we, if the system worked the way that it was meant to, we could have heard more about this earlier, maybe intervened earlier. We could have all done our part to take care of our colleague.
Right.
And it's not, I think that's the part that is always so funny about working in HR is everyone just wants to sort of submit their complaint and then not deal with it anymore and just see the mess get cleaned up. But it's like, no, we're in a workplace. Like it does take all of us. It takes all of us to, to see things and to make each other aware of things and to know better and to support each other. I know that sounds corny, but I will die on that hill.
No, and it's a hill worthy of dying on, I believe, because I think, it is human resources. It's right there in the name, right? The
Yeah.
human element of it. And it would be naive for us to think that, oh, humans are just going to come in. There's never going to be any drama. Nothing's ever going to happen. There's
Yeah.
right and wrong. It's black or white. None of that, that creates a very, very fear-based culture, which
Yes.
is just I haven't seen it work anywhere.
Me neither.
Like what you want is for people to feel like, okay, I can be my human self, which means
Yeah.
I am flawed and I will have imperfections and I will make mistakes. The failure is not final, it's not an off with their head scenario. It's a let's learn from this, you
Yeah.
know. And, those moments are moments to create culture and to reinforce the culture that you want. And I think, again, like taking really drastic action, again, qualifying that there are moments when drastic action
Right.
is the right course of action. But in
Right.
these ones that are a little bit more gray and a little bit more nuanced, you have an opportunity to build culture versus destroy culture. And if you send 6 people out the door
Hmm.
not reporting, you're probably doing more to harm your culture than you are to develop and support your culture.
Yeah.
I could not agree more. And I have one final question for you as we wrap up, because believe it or not, we're at time, which
I
is
can't even
this
believe
flew,
that.
right?
Time flies. Yeah, time flies.
So I feel like this is an appropriate question just based on kind of what you're saying in this particular scenario. So, what's one assumption about HR that you think needs to be challenged?
It's a great question. I would say the number one is that our primary loyalty is to the business, right?
Mm,
There's a real, I was in the gym just last week and I was like dagger to the heart because someone was like, well, HR isn't really there for you. They're there for the company. They're there to protect the company.
yeah.
And I wanted to be like, that's only partially true, right? I want it, but
Yep.
I'm like, we're at the gym. I'm not even going there. But I think there's this common perception that that's the only reason that HR exists. But
Yeah.
most HR professionals I know and the business that I work for, they want HR to exist for the people. It is not primarily to support the business. Of course, we're like finance. We have duties of obligation. There are things that
Right.
we must do to protect the business. But I would say that's true of everyone on the floor as well, and everyone in the
Yes.
business, right? Like they have a duty of care to the business and a responsibility to the business. They're not out spending outrageous sums of money just because they're not stealing, right? All of the same responsibility that I have. The
Yep.
only difference is that I sometimes get different information. It's a different job. But I think there is that real, if you don't get the answer that you want from HR, it must mean it's because they work for the company and not you. The company is the people. So I
Hmm.
work for the people, right? I work for the people. Yeah, I have a boss, but so does everyone else. But we work for each other
Yeah.
because a successful business breeds opportunity. So I think that's the number one. I think I'm not saying that HR doesn't work for the company. We all work for the
We
company.
all do.
We
Yeah. No one's a
all work for
volunteer.
the
We all
company.
make paychecks. We're hired to
Correct.
do a job for the company. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm like, yeah, I'm only here for the people. That's not true either. But I think the fantasy or the misperception is that HR solely exists to protect the company. That's part of the job, but I believe it's part of everybody's job.
Yeah. Very well said. Thank you. I
Thank
love that. And it's so true. You see it everywhere. You see so many, you overhear it at the gym. I overheard it in the grocery store the other day. And I'm always just like, like we're all here to just kind of get paid and do our thing, right? But, we're all here. We have a profession. The integrity of our profession is both for the business and for the people. And that's just the truth. So I
Well,
love
and
it.
and typically when you hear those comments too, I'm often thinking about like flip the script. And I've said this to people in my career is like flip the script. Would you want me to do the opposite of this decision for someone that wasn't you, right? And most of the time
Mm,
people have said to me like, "Oh, okay, well when you put it that way," I'm like, because then it's not really fair to the other people, right? And is it doing good things for the business? Would you not want that action to be taken if this was someone else? And most people are able to do the twist of saying, "Okay, wait a minute. I realize the reason I'm disappointed in this answer is because it's the answer that I want, but I'm
hmm.
not looking at the bigger picture of like, is this a fair decision, but is this a replicable decision? Could you do this over and over? I mean, there are decisions you can make, but you do them enough, you're out of business, right?
Yeah, so true.
So I just think, it's important to shift that perspective and get people to think about, okay, if you were on the other side of this, what would you do? And if you had to do it multiple times, what would you do? Because that's context that's important too. The decision
Oh,
isn't
I
in a
love that.
vacuum. It doesn't just happen with that one person because we're people and we work together. Every
Yeah.
decision affects other people as well.
Yeah. So true.
Yeah.
So true. Well, Robert, thank you so much for this conversation and for offering all your wisdom. I have so many quotes that I can pull from this just to kind of like think through. I mean, even just the like your last point, like if I did this for anybody else, would you feel different? Or I think that that's just such a helpful, it's a helpful rebuttal, I think, when you're the HR person who's kind of dealing with an employee who might be unhappy with the outcome of an investigation for reasons, right? It's a good
Mhm. Of
clutch to kind of explore. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for being here.
course, thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it. And I love this idea of let's talk through these scenarios. It's
Yes.
helpful because we can learn from each other.
Yeah, thank you. That's the point, right? It's like we're all just trying to figure it out. So it's like if we can just get more expertise from each other, why not?
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Robert. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And I hope you have a great day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.